the heartland of America to the left coast, we bring you episode 146 of the Constitution and American Life with the Friends of Publius. In today's segment, we will be focusing on the FOP's favorite F word, federalism. So what has been going on since we were together the last time? Well, I know my friends here have a working knowledge of what was called the Saturday Night Massacre during the Nixon administration. Well, number 47 has given us the January Massacre, as he has fired thousands of civil servants, FBI agents, DOJ attorneys, and inspector generals. I guess the upshot of all this is that there will be more available housing in Northern Virginia. To add to this fun, the current occupant has initiated a trade war by imposing, for no understandable or rational reason, tariffs on both friend and foe alike, which brings back memories of Smoot-Hawley 1930. Let's just hope that we don't experience the same consequences as the world did back then. So let's turn now to this day in history in 1815 and ask our scholars whether the establishment of the world's first commercial cheese factory in Switzerland merits a need to know, nice to know, or nuts to know assessment. This is a topic especially for Professor Moore. So Professor Moore, is that the first established commercial cheese factory in 1815? Need to know, nice to know, or nuts to know?
Need to know, definitely need to know. And I take umbrage to anybody who says that it wouldn't be need to know. I did not know this. 1815 in Switzerland, huh? Okay, well, I guess there goes the Wisconsin exceptionalism argument when it comes to cheese.
Well, it had to be important. I'm assuming cheese predates the American colony. Well, I guess.
Oh, sure, yeah,
But
yeah,
not
but
in a
commercially,
commercial sense.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, I mean that's one of those hey, welcome to class, hour 4, here's like a funny thing, to get us going. That's one of those conversation starters, and then you can get into your lesson. But
well, I know you're
as much as I would like
aficionado
it,
of
yeah.
where does Swiss cheese fall in the annals of cheesedom? Is it
Well,
a
it falls
fine
in
cheese?
Switzerland.
Is it, or is it a pedestrian cheese?
Well, it's kind of pedestrian, but I've in fact, now you ask. I was at the store. I was at a cheese shop the other day, and they had all kinds of funky Swiss. They had all kinds of funky Swiss, but had a little tasting thing going on. Yeah, it's kind of pedestrian.
Sounds like an early 70s song, Funky Swiss. Mike, what are your thoughts? Need to know, nice to know, and you're under some pressure because if you don't say need to know, Professor Moore is going to reach out and slap you.
Well, I'm saying nuts to know, but I do like having my cheese with some nuts, so I think it all kind of works out. Now, I think it's nuts to know. I have nothing more to say.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Two things. One, this is something that seems to be full of holes, and two, I would say it's not nuts to know, it's crackers to know.
Oh, there's that Midwestern dad sense of humor.
Thank you very much.
Coming through. Well, I think it's nice to know because it does contribute to the major health problem in the United States is our love of cheese there. So it's nice to know, kids, that stay away from cheese because it'll kill you.
Well, in Wisconsin, we are a heavy people. We are a heavy people.
Well, when you drive through the great state of Wisconsin and you see these places called cheese castles, they're serious about their cheese.
That's where I was at this weekend, the Cheese Castle, yes.
Well, and I'm going to tell you, students and teachers, if you ever get to the great state of Wisconsin, don't challenge Wisconsinites to a cheese discussion or debate. Mr. Moore watched me do that foolishly with a fellow teacher who was at one of our trainings, and it was one of the most interesting and bizarre experiences of my life because I think he drove like 300 miles to go get a tray of cheese and bring it back to our training to educate me on the finer points of cheese.
Yeah. I think he had like a 25-year aged cheddar he brought back from home.
Oh, it was outstanding cheese. Probably it's what led to my second heart attack. Anyway, so let's begin our discussion on American federalism with our scholar who is known to hang with Robert Morris and attend bear baiting events in Western Pennsylvania, Professor Tim Moore. So, Tim, the students have to deal with a quote from, of course, our favorite Frenchman. Well, maybe not our favorite, but Alexis de Tocqueville, who observes that, he has an observation, and I'm wondering if his observation contradicts or affirms the founders' view of distribution of powers in the American federal system.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you're a Federalist founder, it confirms it because you're trying to convince folks that the Constitution is not going to usurp all kinds of local power. So if you're a Federalist, I know we're being anachronistic here because Tocqueville's talking about this much later. But if you're an anti-federalist, you're going to say, no, we have great suspicions about federal power. So at the founding, I think it depends on which group of founders that you're going to ask that question of. And I also was thinking a little bit about this question, David, and I think maybe contextualizing de Tocqueville's tour here when he made these observations. I mean, the students he came to the States in the 1820s ostensibly to study the prison system in the United States, but he got interested in a lot of other stuff as he wandered around the country and wrote Democracy in America. So he's right in the middle of a time period when we have one political party, but there's two factions within that political party, and one would later become the Whigs. I know I had to get the Whigs in there.
Ding!
And
everybody drink.
Yeah, drinking game. Here's the Whigs. But the Whigs basically were very comfortable with using tax monies to do internal improvements, which Democrats were like, wait a minute, where's that in the Constitution? So, which is another piece of this. It depends on what we do with de Tocqueville. Because originally the Anti-Federalists were quite concerned about the direct taxation, because for them, direct taxation meant it was a temptation for the national government to do all kinds of stuff that would usurp state powers. So a lot of the Anti-Federalist suspicions about the government were related to direct taxation. So he's right in the middle of this. I mean, one of the most shocking, I think, presidential addresses was Adams' address to Congress, where he proposes all kinds of stuff that the Congress should be doing that's not in Article 1, Section 8, implied power stuff. So he's right in the middle of this beginnings of this discussion about federal power. Does it expand beyond the powers that are enumerated in the context of his tour? So it's kind of a yes and no to your question.
Well, so I'm glad you brought up the issue of context, but and it seems like you're saying contextually we got a problem with what he says because of what's going on nationwide and the role that the federal government, and then textually. I mean, I look at what is the purpose of the Philadelphia Convention and writing a new constitution. What does the language of Article 1, Section 8 say? And just giving those factors, how can he say that the federal government is scarcely in charge of anything other than foreign affairs? If you understand why they have the convention, why they write a new constitution, and you look at the text of Article 1, Section 8, part of me wonders what in the hell is Tocqueville thinking?
Well, I think he's a Frenchman and he comes from a royal system, and he understands top-down centralized control. And as he tours, I mean, he's quite taken with the town hall meetings around the country, but most notably New England. So he's coming to a country that largely can ignore federal national power. And he's mulling around with people that it doesn't seem like they're paying much attention to it. So as a Frenchman, I think he's plopping himself into an entirely different swimming pool when he comes to America.
And he's not saying that they're constitutionally prohibited. He's just observing and noticing that they don't seem to be playing much of a role in the daily lives.
Yep.
So is it accurate to say that he's not saying that they don't have the constitutional authority? He's just saying, hey, in my observations of traveling around here, I don't see much of the federal government.
Well, he might have been aware of the constitutional discussions that are taking place amongst the elites, but those beginnings, the Whig Jacksonian fights that they would have about how flexible can we use the powers, implied powers.
So, Chris, and then I think I kind of want to build on this, Tim, but Chris, we hear consistently from a group of constitutional scholars that the American Constitution was intended to be a living document. Given that, wasn't the growth and expansion of the federal government in the 19th century both anticipated and consistent with the text of the Constitution?
Can I go Tim answer and say yes and no?
Yeah. No. Yes. No. Whatever.
I think in a way it was, but when you're talking, are you talking into the 18th century or to the 1800s?
Into the 19th, so the late 1800s, and then throughout the 1900s. All right. I mean, getting to this core, this argument that of limited federal powers, I've always had a problem with. All right.
Well, they were limited to a scope, to a degree. And this is listening to Tim, it made me think of a couple of actual Supreme Court cases that become very big, and that's Gibbons v. Ogden and McCulloch v. Maryland. I mean, those are two early cases where the court, and this is, of course, Chief Justice Marshall, who really is kind of a nationalist. I mean, not in a dirty sense of the word, in the arguments over the Constitution, but he does see the national government having this power. So I do see some court decisions there that are going to expand that power and use the necessary and proper clause to expand that power. But in terms of the growth of the government or the growth of government power, I think you see the growth of government power, but I also we see the pushback early on, as Tim mentioned, with Jackson, and Jackson's taking some measures to veto legislation. You see the pushback, and I'm going to say it, the Whigs pushing back on Jackson as well. So you've got this ebb and flow. Does the federal government itself grow in size? Not really, in terms of adding more people and more departments. That really becomes a 20th century thing in terms of the growth of the federal government. And just going back to your question with Tim, and this still is true today, our focus tends to be on the national government all the time, but the government that we bump against and run into throughout our lives is the state government. So I think to a degree it's to be expected that as we grow, the government is going to actually grow some power, but the actual growth of government is not that great.
Well, I mean, and that goes back to Tim, to what you were saying. I mean, I'm wondering with how kids should approach this, because there's this practical thing that Tocqueville is observations, but then the question talks about, kind of, the Constitution's intent as far as federal state, which is more of to me, a constitutional question versus a political culture kind of question. I'm wondering which way should kids go?
Well, I think there's an economic, I can't believe I'm going to be the economic advocate here too. There's an economic piece. The federal government originally had all of its money through tariff, and it was like 5%. So there isn't a whole lot of money to play with. And I jotted these statistics down. You get to the War of 1812, it goes to 12%. 1815, 25%. Post 1816, 35%. By the time you get to the 1860s, the tariff is 60%. So what I'm proposing is there's a lot more money to play with that the federal government now has. Okay, you got money and you're going to spend it. What are you going to spend it on? So these questions about federal prerogatives, implied powers, there's money to play with because the tariff expands balloons extensively. And the second point I would make, and this is well after Tocqueville, and maybe students should really look into the 1860s Lincoln's Congress. Lincoln's Congress does some really remarkable big government stuff. Now, that's largely because all the Jacksonian Democrats have seceded and they're in the Confederacy. So they create the Morrill Land Grant Act, the Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act. There's a centralized banking law. So these are big government projects. Now, this is 40 years after Tocqueville. But my point being, federalism and big government really, I would say, is born, to your point about how the evolution of an expansion of the country. It's born of that late 1800s window when industrialization and expansion really plays heavily on that growth of federal prerogative powers.
Chris?
Well, I was thinking too, I would absolutely agree with what Tim said, but again, if you go back to say Fed 39 or Fed 45, where Madison is, I don't know how sincerely we should take him at his word in trying to say, well, it's not, we are the Federalists here, right? That's what we're calling ourselves. We believe in truly federal power. You guys must be against us, but great naming, great branding there. But they is trying to assuage some fears here that we're not we're creating a government that's limited in its power, so you guys don't have to worry. It's we're not going to usurp you. But again, I mean, it's an age-old argument that we've had since our inception. Even fighting a war over it, and we're still having the arguments today over this division of power. But if you take a look at, but again, had we gotten the government that Madison wanted, things would have turned out much differently. We don't get, the national veto. We don't get the national veto, right? But then again, Madison, one of the author of the Virginia Resolution, along with his buddy, Jefferson, and the Kentucky Resolution, pushing back on the Alien and Sedition Act. So, he's kind of playing both sides there.
Yeah, and I just, when you said, the idea of government getting more power versus government getting bigger, that you wondered, and I guess my question was, did they anticipate that would happen?
Oh,
and
yeah.
It seems to me that, you're right that most of the executive departments will be developed in the 20th century, but there's still 4 more added in the 19th century from the original, which tells me that again, there was some understanding that population growth, land growth, that the government would get bigger.
Oh, I think they understood that clearly that the nation was going to grow, right? And they may ask the question, how did the nation get so big? I don't know, but they
mommy, daddy. Okay.
I wasn't going to go there, but that was kind of implied, much like some of the powers from the government, right? Implied powers. But you see that already in terms of, getting Western land claims given up to the federal government. That might be one of the first big steps in terms of growth of federal power, in terms of our national government powers to get the states to give up those Western land claims. So they understood that. If you think about the proclamation line of 1763 at the close of the French and Indian War. What do you mean we can't go past here? We planned on going past here.
Right, and the whole notion of new territories. The fact that they have, a clause of the Constitution about adding new territories. Yeah, we could say that, well, that's narrowly tailored to the land that existed. My sense is, they had a sense that
they had it prior to the Constitution. The Land Ordinance of 1785, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So they're already laying the groundwork for Western expansion.
Yeah. So Chris had brought up a clause which I think is very important to this question. We look at powers between federal and state, and that is the elastic clause, or known as the necessary and proper clause. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, does that clause contradict the belief that the Constitution created a limited government of enumerated powers? Yeah, I know. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
No, it's a good question for the students to think about. My answer is going to start off and not be all that great. Hopefully, get better as I go. Um, yes, it could. Yes, it could. Um, I think what the students need to think about is the key to understanding the necessary and proper clause for me is the first principle is that the national government is one of enumerated powers, right? So the necessary and proper clause, and it's my reading that this is what Marshall was trying to get at in McCullough was that if the ends of the government actions, right, if it can be pegged back to something that's enumerated, then he's going to give the national government some leeway to do it. Now, is that the kind of exception that you could drive a truck through if you wanted to? Um, I think you could, and I think that's one of the criticisms. I, I think what's I think what's interesting for the students to think about is just maybe to even think about what limited government means in at the founding and what limited government may mean today. I don't like a lot of the concepts we talk about in this curriculum. I don't think it's static. I think people's notion of what the purpose of government is and what government should and should not do and has the legitimacy to do has changed over time. And with that has changed this balance between the ability for Congress to do its job and to do what is set out in the enumeration, but not to just make up powers and not to make up powers that aren't there. My reading of the court decisions on this since McCullough is the court has found it very, very hard to know what this line is. And I think from what I saw in some law review articles I was looking at, the jury's still kind of out of whether the Affordable Care Act decision, where Roberts basically finds that Congress could not use the necessary and proper clause through for the individual mandate, they had to go to it was the spending clause, as I
The
recall.
general welfare clause, taxing clause. Yeah.
Taxing.
Is that as revolutionary as we thought US v. Lopez was going to be with the Commerce Clause? Is that something now that's sitting there waiting for the courts to limit the next big decision after the ACA decision? The court said that the necessary proper clause could be used in the way that Congress said it was going to be used. But I think that decision stands there as kind of like a possible case that the court could return to if they did think that it was national powers getting too big. The final thing I'll say is it's interesting that at the founding, right, the big question it was the reverse question we were asking ourselves, like, how is it that we can find a way for the national government to be just a little bit stronger because we need the national government to be a little bit stronger to help with commerce and to help build up this vision. And now after, 200 odd years later, it's kind of like a question of if are the states becoming irrelevant? Can Congress just do whatever they want using a combination of commerce and necessary and proper, and therefore state sovereignty kind of gone away? So it's the reverse kind of question based on the political experience and some of the things we were just talking about, just the natural growth of government, which I would add this growth in government has come as we have consented either through elections or through implicit consent that we
Yeah.
want the government in our business in a way that I think Madison and Jefferson and maybe even Hamilton might be shocked of the way government's in our business. So
Right, and that gets to the core question of this, I guess it's tension or conflict between, we'll call it popular sovereignty, the will of the people, and then the text and language of the Constitution. And I want to build on that here. But Tim, you had something you wanted to say, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a great question to like, is necessary and proper clause in violation of the principle of limited government? Now, if you're James Wilson, and he was like one of the earliest speeches on relax, folks, it's enumerated, and now he gets pilloried for the next year and a half for that speech. But he articulates enumerated powers, relax, relax, relax. Now, anti-federalists say, don't pee in my ear and tell me it's raining, because this necessary and proper clause is a new declaratory act. Declaratory Act in 1766 was Parliament at that point said, we have the right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever, and anything you've done as a colony is irrelevant, null and void. Well, anti-federalists said necessary and proper clause smells an awful lot like Declaratory Act, and over and over and over in all of these anti-federalist essays. And the general welfare, you talk about an invitation, to drive a truck, that's an exception big enough to drive a truck through. So Wilson is critical on this relax, and I'm glad Chris pointed out Fed 39. So this Wilson speech and everybody after that saying, no, this is a declaratory act. Don't tell us any other. But Mike's point about interpretation is critical here. Is it 17 through 3,500 powers, or is it just one power tethered to the previous 17?
One thing about Wilson too is prior to that, he was one of the few guys that was actually talking about implied powers in the government for a national bank. So even before the convention, he's like, well, of course, if we're going to have a national government, it makes sense that we should have a national bank. So it's ironic that he does trying to assuage the anti-federalist fears. And I would encourage students to go back and read the necessary and proper clause in its entirety, but then break it down into its component parts, because there's a couple of ways I've seen law scholars talk about this, how to read that clause. Or how to read that clause within the Constitution. Is it foregoing powers or all laws? So make sure you're reading that language in there, because it's a very interesting clause. Again, a couple of Mack trucks could be driven through that.
Do other countries have necessary and proper clause statements, Mike? I mean, in some iteration of that?
No, they don't. I mean, it's either that the powers are much more explicit, so there's many more powers, or most places don't have a federal system like ours. It says the exact opposite. There's going to be something said, anything not mentioned that we're saying that the states, right, the regions have control over, we'll assume the federal government has control over it. So they reverse it to give the central government more authority. Yeah.
Well, and so let's I'm going to pose this to you, Tim, and it kind of blends the necessary and proper and what we've been talking about, because they could not, in enumerating powers, there's no way they could anticipate 50, 100 years down the road. All right. I know they tried, and I know, and again, my reading is they tried to keep it vague and flexible enough to allow the central government to respond. So it comes down to issues that are not enumerated. So if we look at Section 8, here's enumerated powers, and then we look at Section 9, here's the powers prohibited. There's still, to me, what our friend Sue Leeson used to talk about, a lot of white space there. And we can simply start with, as Chris said, the Bank of the United States. So what advice do you give kids on how does one go about reading this document, given that reality, that the enumerated powers and the denied powers still don't cover all the possibilities? So is it, like Mike just said, our default is national government, state government? What would you recommend to kids on ways to read them?
I think it boils down to judicial hermeneutics, really, which is judicial interpretation. I mean, if you're a textualist, it only takes you so far. I mean, do the words themselves answer all these scenarios? Does the original intent answer all of these scenarios? I mean, the Way the People book does a good job, I think, laying out 4 interpretive schemes. I forget which lesson it is, but it's, you've got textualism, you got original intent, and I tend to be interpreting by principles rather than original intent or text. What are the basic principles, and can we make a rationale based upon those principles? And then the fourth one is just we'll do whatever the hell we want. Then the court becomes a very political arbiter. So I think how I would answer your question, if I understand it, is students, how you're going to address this issue of interpreting over time and with change over time has a lot to do with what kind of interpretive scheme you want to use to address that change over time. And I think some of those interpretive schemes, you run up against some problems really quickly. And my second kind of snarky piece of advice is you may have to face the fact that we're a little more British than we admit to be. That meaning, the British system is an evolutionary system, and it's whatever Parliament has decided at that given time throughout their, centuries of existence. So, the fact that the Parliament is not limited by a written constitution per se allows them to be pretty flexible in what they can do. Well, we may have some elements of Britishness in the way we do our system, and we might want to just kind of embrace that. I say flavor 3 of interpretation, interpreting by principles, is kind of British in a way. And I'm not comfortable with version 4, where the court just does whatever politically is expedient. And I see some severe
you do understand that and I'll just, for the sake of not knowing what label, judicial conservatives or political conservatives would have a problem with your number 3.
I realize it, and some of my best friends are conservatives.
Go ahead.
No, you're right, David. You're right.
Chris, bail me out here before.
Oh no, I was laughing because I was thinking when Tim talked about, okay, when you have these certain principles, but sometimes you run up against it. I was thinking of the Louisiana Purchase and our friend Mr. Jefferson, who was a strict constructionist, and yet I got the best land deal in history. Am I going to say, well, it's not written down here, I can't, but am I going to pass up 2 cents an acre? Sold.
There's a great letter he wrote to John Dickinson, and the quote was, I wrote this down because I chuckled out loud this afternoon. Was I to pass up this opportunity for the greater good of the nation? Okay.
Well, and I think, again, you provided, a pathway of guidance to students by saying, well, given this big white space of our Constitution, I'm going to use fundamental principles combined with the necessary and proper clause, which Mike said one way to be understood is that it only applies to those fundamental principles there, and that's how you maneuver this white space. Chris or Mike, any other suggestions?
Well, don't forget general welfare. There's that. You can use general welfare.
Well, as long as it's attached to a tax.
It's hard to make it through the day without a couple healthy rationalizations. So, I mean, we can rationalize, and we have throughout our history, we've rationalized an expansion of power that wasn't necessarily written there because, again, I mean, the quote that Tim just shared, am I going to pass this up for the good of the nation? So.
Well, and again, hopefully students are seeing a little bit of the frustration because they are asked specifically to delineate the powers of the federal government and the Constitution to those given to the states. Well, to those in Section 10 given to the states, again, fairly limited. To those denied to the national government, fairly limited. And even those granted to the national government, fairly squishy in the words of Tim Moore there. So, but I'm just trying to give kids some kind of weather vane here of, well, here's what you might think about as an approach to analysis here. I think Tim's given us one there.
Well,
so,
if you're going to use your weather vane, you have to see which way, we've got to see which way the wind is blowing in that, right? Because we know that people that will change. I mean, gosh, I don't know if this is related, but I always like that last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, where it talks about all the powers that states have. These states have these powers basically that are powers of nations. And just recently we looked at the South Carolina document of secession, And they lift that last paragraph, and now the state has returned to its equal position among the other nations of the earth, and they reclaim those 5 powers listed in that last paragraph: to levy war, conclude peace, conclude peace, contract alliances. So it's interesting that they, when they left the Union, when they seceded from the Union, they went back to their equal station among the other nations of the world.
Mike, any thoughts?
Maybe we can feel fortunate that Congress doesn't really want to do much these days. So
Yeah, but what all that does is kick it to the executive.
I know I'm
Yeah.
being funny. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, and you were. That again. I'm chuckling there. So, Chris, and again, Professor Moore, I didn't mean conservative as a pejorative. So we'll just talk about critics of living constitutionalism. How about that? But and again, the weather vane. We are definitely in a period. All right, and we're seeing it day by day. The idea to shrink, all right, the national government, to cut departments and remove hundreds of thousands of employees because it's gotten way too big. And a lot of those critics of living constitutionalism and expanded federal government hang their hat on the 10th Amendment, Professor Kavanaugh. Do you agree that the 10th Amendment is a pathway to reverse the trend? All right, that in fact the 10th Amendment is in its own separate category of limits on the national government.
I think it is a pathway that's always open, and it's open for both liberal and conservatives, and we've seen both use it. So I mean, this states have constantly challenged the power of the national government, whether they use the 10th Amendment or not. So, yeah, the 10th Amendment is absolutely a pathway available for people to challenge the power of the national government on 10th Amendment claims. You
Well,
don't,
I'm just wondering because the court in Darby versus U.S. said that 10th Amendment is redundant. It's saying that it was already that it's saying something that's already self-evident in the Constitution. So using it independently, they don't give it much legitimacy.
well, again, that's one opinion. And of course, we could think about the term expressly, which was left out of the 10th Amendment. Of course, it's not there, so we don't want to read that into it. But that was an argument about the 10th, to put that word expressly in there. But the other thing is, too, back to your original question, David, or not to your original point a few minutes ago about all this white space. So if you've got all this white space and it doesn't say that the national government can do it, and it doesn't deny it to the states, who gets to claim it, right? So there, I mean, I think the 10th Amendment helps provide at least a foundation from which to argue, because then you can go to the 10th Amendment and says, okay, these powers not given to the national government nor denied to the state governments belong to the states and to the people respectively. So I think that 10th, I would disagree with Darby, that the idea that the 10th Amendment provides a floor from which to argue. It gives you a basis from which to argue. And we've seen both liberal and conservative people use it. So, but again, you don't need to argue the 10th Amendment. You don't usually use the 10th Amendment. I mean, I don't know how this is. I don't know if this is related, but it just came across my head. I was thinking about this because, again, just having covered the Civil War, thinking about all the cases that existed before Dred, with the northern states not honoring the fugitive slave clauses, the fugitive slave clause within the Constitution itself, and the fugitive slave clause from the Compromise of 1850. So you saw states, northern states, not following the law. And this is one of the things that South Carolina is going to argue about, and many Southerners argue about, that the national government is not enforcing its own laws. And it's interesting because I had a student then said, isn't this similar to some of the arguments that we see today about immigration, where you have some northern states, or not northern states, but some states, more blue states, or maybe more blue cities, that are not going to cooperate with the current roundup of people that are here undocumented. And I said, it's exactly the same argument. People resisting the national government using its power.
So is it fair to
it's
say?
interesting. I would caution the use of the 10th Amendment, because if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I can see a person who's an original intent person. Let's use the 10th Amendment as a break on federal government. Well, if you don't have to be a constitutional scholar to figure out that I think is it 9 states in their recommendatory amendments sent along a recommended amendment that the 10th Amendment should sound like expressly. 9 sent that along. Well, it doesn't wind up in the 10th Amendment. So if you want to make a big deal out of the 10th Amendment and you start doing your historical research for original intent, you're going to discover that the 10th Amendment was pretty much eviscerated when expressly was left out. So I have my suspicions about the effectiveness of using the 10th Amendment as a substantive break
Well,
on federal power if you look into the history of how we got it.
I'm gonna disagree because if I'm approaching this from a state viewpoint, I need to have somewhere to hang my hat. I just can't say,
Right.
well, it's in this white space somewhere. So that's what I'm saying is the 10th Amendment provides a floor, maybe not a ceiling, but it provides that floor for you, because you've got to make that argument. Where does my state get the power to trump the
Right.
national government and what it's doing? So
But
that
what,
10th Amendment
but
provides
you
that
hang
floor.
your hat on the enumeration, Article 1, Section 9 and 10. And if it, and now I get the same thing, I guess, goes if it's not covered there, all right, but those powers not delegated to the national government. Okay, well, our problem is a little bit Clause 18, but we look at the limitations on the national government. They're pretty, I mean, that's where my frustration is, Chris, is is the 10th Amendment argument to me is I guess, can you name me, and we have Lopez, all right, that's the first time in 60 years that the court strikes down an action of Congress there. But I guess it comes down to, are all of these questions, they're not constitutional questions, they're political questions about the Constitution? Is that how we can summarize this?
It very well could be, because again, you can see, I mean, you see more conservative states attorney generals banding together to challenge some of Obama's stuff, and same thing with Biden. And you're going to see right now, you're going to see more liberal states attorney generals banding, already doing this, challenging some of President Trump's actions. So it is a political question that's being played out using the Constitution. But I do think the 10th, I mean, I'm not ready to write up the 10th Amendment as not being important. I think it is important. And I think it's hard to go to that, David, to either the 8th or 9th or Section 10s of Article 1, because we know that there's so much white space there. It just becomes very difficult. And I would say Lopez is, obviously Commerce Clause, just Congress going too far in its interpretation of the Commerce Clause. I don't know.
Well, and I ask this sometimes of kids, to name me something that the national government does that's not delegated currently. And again, okay, we'll grant the interpretation of commerce in the Lopez was too far, but that's specifically about the Commerce Clause. Nobody doubts that the national government has commerce powers. There in Lopez, they said, well, they stretched that beyond commerce. But anything else, can somebody name something else right now that the national government does that's beyond their delegated powers?
Are you talking about Congress or the president, or either?
Either, because the necessary and proper clause applies to the president as well.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen some statutory violations just within the last few days in terms of that. But again, we've said this repeatedly, we need Congress to step up and actually use its enumerated powers, like the power of the purse, the idea that somehow the president is going to freeze spending on programs, on money that's already been allocated. We know that is.
Well, Chris, that's a separation of powers issue, not a federalism issue.
Oh, okay, but you were talking about people going too far, so.
Yeah, well, right. I guess, and let's leave the current administration out of it since it's brand new. What is there out there? And I ask people all the time who bring this up. Oh, the federal government's powers they've gone way too far. And I say, name one. Name something they've done that's beyond the delegated powers doctrine there.
Well, yeah, let me think. The federal government right now, to get any grants to address homelessness, federal government has said since 2009 that you have to adopt a housing first policy around homelessness. Now,
Mhm.
I'd have to look and see. I don't know where Congress is claiming that it has this interagency on homelessness that there are, I'm not sure what the enumerated power that it's dictating to local governments what their housing policy should be to get federal grants.
Well, that gets down to, I mean, it is a current question. If the federal government's going to provide, and you're talking about grant power, this is
Yeah.
if they're going to provide money, don't they have the authority to provide conditions for that money? I mean, that gets back to speed limit and transportation funds and drinking age and
Yeah, I
transportation
was
funds.
thinking of South Dakota v. Dole, right? Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
where would you hang the hat in the enumerated powers with the
The
grant?
spending power of Congress that they have the right, to the power of the purse, and I would assume inherent power to put conditions on that through
Yeah,
their authority as the legislative branch. That's my assumption.
yeah.
And again, I don't know of any case where the court has come in and say, Congress, you can't put those conditions on spending.
What
That doesn't
about
mean I know, it doesn't mean there isn't any. It's just I'm not
Go
aware
back
of
to
it.
your question, David? What about during COVID? What about during the lockdowns?
Well, the question is, does the 14th Amendment rearrange the federal system to such a degree that the federal government now has police powers? All right, beyond the imagination of the framers, because we know
Well,
state governments have police powers.
right, but that's what I'm wondering. I'm trying to think of an example for your question. I'm wondering. I'm trying to think of this off the top of my head, but I don't know in terms of like whether it be requiring vaccinations for certain people or closing down places, public places, or were they merely recommending to states? And I don't know the answer to that. So that could
It,
be.
right. So the question goes down is the creation of national health agencies by Congress. Do they have the power to create national, like the CDC? All right, National Institutes of Health. Do they have the authority to do that? All right, and if they have the authority to do that, are they by implication giving those agencies the police power? All right, to regulate health. All right.
Well, not anymore. Not after Loper Bright. I
Well,
mean,
I don't know if we know that.
oh, I think I mean, after Loper Bright and the administrative agencies not being able to be expert on this idea, and so this power taken away from administrative agencies, which is a topic we've not even broached yet, because you talk about an expansion expansion of government power. It has been through the administrative state, and with Loper Bright coming down, which actually goes away from the Chevron, reverses the Chevron doctrine. I think you're going to see many more states push
but
back
but
against.
Loper Bright does not say that Congress can't create administrative agencies. Loper Bright says that Congress has to carry out. I know it's kind of laughable, but they have to be more specific in their legislation of
Yeah,
how to carry out the
yeah.
powers of the administrative agency. So, I mean, my question is, where does Congress get the authority to create administrative agencies? And if by doing so, by implication, aren't they increasing federal power?
Well, I don't know the answer directly, but I do recall there are a fair amount of Cold War administrative agencies that were created, and in the preamble, uh, in the statute that was creating these agencies, they often invoked national security. They often invoked general welfare. So they were invoking parts of the Constitution in their rationale for creating those agencies. Now, again, sometimes it may be hard to keep a straight face um, as to the rationale they're invoking from the text of the Constitution. But I think I'm right on that. That a lot of Cold War agencies, Congress felt obliged to explain where they were looking at in the Constitution to do these agencies.
Well, clearly, one of the delineations between state and national powers was, as we've taught, police powers
Yeah.
to regulate the health and safety and the public morals. Would you guys agree that in the 20th century legal history jurisprudence, whether through the 14th Amendment or national security, that it's become common understanding that the national government has police powers? Do we agree to that or no? That's not true.
I think there's
Well, we're just not going to call it that because that's offensive within our tradition. Now, you might have a point, David. Potato, potato. If it's a rose is a rose is a rose.
Well, and I think this also, I would agree with Tim on that in terms of we may not call it that, but it certainly has. But I think we got to go back to something Mike was talking about with grants, and I think that speaks to a larger issue as well in terms of the power of the national government that may not be spelled out, but it is the power of the purse strings, which they have that power. But now we understand that programs that states like to run become so expensive, so they're constantly looking to the federal government to help get, think Title IX schools, right? Think about different areas just in education alone that states are kind of strapped when it comes to those programs, and so they look to the federal government to get that help and funding these programs. But then, with money comes strings. So if you want this, then this is what you have to do. And David, you make the point earlier that, of course, they have that power. If they're going to dole out the money, they have that power. And so states then have had to say, okay, yeah, we'll do that then because we need the money because we don't have that kind of budget in our state.
I mean, I know to say let's not get to the most contemporary, but we know it's a big issue on federal relief funds because the administration has said, well, if California wants these emergency funds, they've got to jump through these hoops or they got to do these things. And as much as that outraged California, all right, one must question, well, do they not have the authority to do that? I mean, it's not, it may be politically a bad idea or offensive, but I don't know if it's constitutionally, forbidden for, the executive to say, hey, you want these FEMA funds, then you need to come up with a better water policy and land management policy.
We're back to South Dakota v. Dole.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. So, I don't know if any. I mean, I guess my general question to you, Professor Williams, is: do you accept, or where are you on this notion that states play a dominant role? I mean, I still believe that they do. I don't know dominant, but I think they play a significant role in our daily lives here. But I've one thing that's always interested me is this laboratory of democracy. One of the key roles of states is they're a laboratory of democracy. And I've always wondered, what are they a laboratory for? Are they a laboratory for the nation, or are they just a laboratory for other individual states? What's your understanding of that term?
I think historically it's been both. Um, I think I think probably there's probably more examples of states learning from each other and adopting because there's probably a little more political flexibility to do that. And I imagine the research shows that there's tendencies in the last 20 years between blue states and red states kind of copying each other, states copying California's environmental protections, for example. But it has happened where, and I think this is where this is the value of a federal system. If we're going to be going through all these hoops and these white spaces and trying to think through this, it's the states can be a laboratory that the national government can then say, okay, this seemed to work or not work at a local level. We can now envision what might happen if we scale it up. And I know it didn't happen, it wasn't a copy and paste with healthcare reform, but Massachusetts experiment with healthcare reform, kind of finding that middle ground there with Romney in terms of insurance companies are going to play a bigger role, but we're going to allow a little more, protection. That's something that was picked up by the national government, became kind of the kernel of the ACA. I don't have examples as clear off the top of my head, but I do know that states in the late 80s and early 90s were experimenting with different types of welfare reforms that
Yep.
then the Clinton administration then kind of tried to cherry pick the best. Now, when you get into the actual creating of these policies, right, and the actual, okay, how do we take the good and bad lessons? How do we determine what's good or bad? How do we scale that up? There's a lot of human error, and there's a lot of the two scholars that were most involved with Clinton with his welfare reform. At the end of the day, they left the White House. They were so upset with the way that there was supposed to be a lot more in welfare reform that was going to provide support for those going through the welfare process. There was this idea of raising the minimum wage should be part of a big package, and all that kind of stuff was left out. So these scholars kind of left. So in terms of an actual practical implementation, it gets a little tricky. But it might be, I don't know what Chris and Tim and you think, it might be one of the things that we don't take as much advantage of as we should, because we're so polarized and so politicized that if you're in a blue state, you're never going to look to see what a red state's doing because you're just going to assume it's all going to be bad. That maybe we're missing opportunities to really learn how other states are dealing with public policy issues that could then be implemented at the federal level.
Well, I am curious, given the differences of where we all live, and Mike, I don't know if you agree with me, my sense is California, it's a 50-50, I'd say 60-40. I deal mostly with the state, not with the
Yeah.
federal there. I'm wondering in North Dakota and Wisconsin, gentlemen, if you have the same sense as far as the role of the state versus the role of the national government in your lives.
Oh, it's still the state.
Yeah.
Very much so. Very much so. And actually,
I mean, oh, go ahead, Chris.
no, I was going to go back to something else. You go.
Well, yeah, I was too. I mean, Wisconsin was a lab. Workman's comp came out of Wisconsin way back in the day, early 20th century. A lot of progressive ideas out of Oregon and Wisconsin. So the lab theory was when this statement was made. I forget who made this laboratory democracy, but it was in that progressive era. More recently, a lot of the welfare, Mike mentioned the welfare reform, educational reform. There was a lot of rattle and hum in the states, including Wisconsin, about could vouchers actually work within the public school system. So there was a lot of experimentation going on educationally in the 90s as well. That trickled up, and of course, that to Mike's point, the policy, it goes through a committee, and it comes out looking very different than what we thought it would be. So,
well, that makes me think of something else too, because there's a negative side of that too. When I think of like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that actually, will write state laws, and then they just go state by state by state by state by state, writing these laws in the state. So that's not necessarily a laboratory for democracy. It's just a rubber stamp as they move through and special interest groups. The other thing I was thinking though, David, I want to go back for a second. And I could follow some where the 10th Amendment has been used in more recent decades is the anti-commandeering doctrine. And the idea is that the government cannot issue commands to the states. They can't require them to administer federal laws. I think of Prince versus U.S., PRINTZ versus U.S., invalidated provisions of the Brady Act that required state law enforcement officers to conduct background checks on prospective gun purchases, right? But then again, you also had people use that for sanctuary cities and to protect state legalization of marijuana. So there is that provision there. There is for students to take a look at the anti-commandeering doctrine. Is something to take a look at in terms of states using that 10th that they can't, the feds, and we'll see this now too with immigration enforcement. We'll absolutely see it now with immigration enforcement.
So, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time here on this very complicated and huge question of federalism. And so we'd like to give you an opportunity to provide final thoughts and recommendations to students and teachers when dealing with Unit 4, Question 1. Professor Williams?
Yeah, and forgive me, Dave, because I'm going to take one of your insights and I'm going to roll with it. So thank you for laying it out there.
Well, if it was an insight of mine, I've already forgotten about it. So you roll with it.
Yeah, no. I think this, as we've kind of, demonstrated, this conversations can get pretty dense, pretty in the weeds. The court's decisions on this are complicated. The law review articles written on this stuff is complicated. And students, what I'd recommend you do is get to the fundamental question that Dave was asking at the end. I think it'd be great for you to have a discussion and maybe keep a, this is going to sound so dorky, but keep a journal for a couple of days about the ways in which you come into contact with government. Just make it general. And then start writing that stuff down. And then ask yourself, okay, which government was I coming in contact with? Was it local? Was it state? Was it a combination? Was it federal? And then you can ask yourself, okay, where does that come from? Where does that power come from? Is it coming from a city charter, state constitution? Is it part of the enumerated? And to have those kind of conversations about the way in which you are actually experiencing government, that to me is like, if there is a practical, what's going to make you a better active citizen after going through this question, if you could do that, and if you could articulate that, maybe in to the judges, that you've actually thought about how your local community, how you're experiencing government through your own communities, I think that'd be great. And I think that that would give this some real sort of on the ground kind of feel that you might lose if you get too far in interpreting the courts and from McCullough up to the present. So that'd be my advice.
Thank you. Chris?
I'm going to borrow from the great historian Evan Morgan, because I think he said that when it comes to foreign policy, the Constitution was an invitation to argument. And I think when it comes to federalism, the Constitution is an invitation to argument. We can't help it because it's baked into our cake. It's baked into our DNA. As I alluded to earlier with the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and the argument that it took the Civil War for us to change the verb. It used to be prior to the Civil War, we say the United States are. After the Civil War, we said the United States is. So it took a very bloody conflict, and we're still arguing over it today, and it's okay. We're supposed to. I mean, I think that goes back to the framers' original idea of creating a federal system of government where we're governed by different, whether it be municipalities or counties or states. I mean, somebody said that we have over 10,800 governments, something like that, when you combine all of them together, some crazy number. So of course we're going to argue about, who has this power. And sometimes we're not going to like what the national government does, depending on what your personal preferences are. So it's okay to think about how that works. I would also think of how this plays out in your state too. So if you're in a blue state and you've got a red district, does that state government dictate? They take over that idea of home rule, which is an interesting concept within the state. Or if you live in a red state and you've got a blue city, like say Austin, Texas, we want local control until that local control doesn't reflect what we want at a different level. So even if you drill down on this issue between national and state, if you go state and then local, we see some of those same arguments. So just think about different scenarios you can anticipate and be prepared, because there are a plethora out there.
Professor Moore?
Yeah, I just want to put a pin in something Chris said. This is from the beginning. I mean, the single most important fight amongst Federalists and Anti-Federalists was the defining the federal and state relationship. So much ink was spilt over that, so I guess my thought would be, just kind of relax. We've been fighting about this, and it's kind of what we do. The other thing it's maybe this is way out in left field, but I would follow the money. In other words, if you want to think about federal-state relationship, look at the history of federal revenue sharing. If you want to get a glimpse, get an insight as to the role of federal-state relationship, look at how revenue sharing throughout our history, and it's been throughout our history. I mean, there was a big fight, the Webster-Haynes debates, for heaven's sakes, is who gets that money from Western land sales. So look at revenue sharing might give you some insight as to federalism.
So many things here. So first off, one thing I really kind of made the light go on was when Professor Moore said, or asked the question, are we more British than we like to admit as far as, the type of government that we are. We like to talk about federalism and states being, much more powerful, at least in the beginning. But there's a unitary nature to our political history and political culture that you might want to consider. Next, you can always try the strategy that the FOPs use, and that is in every question you can say yes and no. Uh, so that seems to be a strategy amongst our friends here. I also want to point out that I think what comes through is I've learned in the last year or so that I am a hypocrite. I've generally been a fan of centralized government and unitary government and damn the states, and I praise the Virginia Plan by Madison and things. But now I'm a big fan of state powers and state authority within the federal system here. So politics is really contextual. Constitutional understanding might be contextual as well, or definitely is. Lastly, I just want to say to Mike, you and I in the West Coast, we got to do a better job of representing vis-a-vis euphemisms and colloquialisms. I forget. I think Professor Moore used one this evening, and I just thought, well, where did that come from? And I can't remember what it is because, hey, I'm an old man, but
Was
I'll
it
look through the video.
was it cheese related?
Yeah, it could have been. It could have been. I can't remember. But Mike and I, we need to come up with some, California sayings other than dude, kind of thing here. So, hey, in our next program, we're going to be looking at Unit 1, Question 1. And Mike Williams is just so excited about this because we're going to be talking about the 15th century and the Renaissance. So, until that time,
Oh, cool.
it is so cool. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye bye, bye bonds.